They set on him sometime after dusk, while he was walking up the shoulder of US Road 27, which was called Main Street a mile back where it passed through town. A mile or two farther on, he had been planning to turn west on 63, which would have taken him to the turnpike and the start of his long trip north. His sense had been dulled maybe by the 2 beers that he had just downed, but he had known something was wrong. He was just getting around to remembering the 4 or 5 heavy-set Tonys down at the far end of the bar when they broke cover and ran at him. Welcome everyone to another installment of my Stephen King analysis series, the 4th part of my King algorithm series, because it's been a while since we touched the stand, actually since 2022, and while I read Desperation, that has some interesting things to say about the subject today, well, why not work with our 4th archetype? I'm AdalisaZ, and today we are continuing our hike through Stephen King's longest book as we meet the 4th archetype, the figure of authority, which is one of the few that can fall on either side of the good and evil conflict. In the stand, the main one is Nick Andrews, who later also functions as a different archetype, but that is for later. And yes, saying main one implies that there are others, so let's start our trip down the highway, shall we? The figure of authority is a very curious character in the King's formula, because he's a little bit of a joker in the deck. He can be, and most of the time is, part of the good guys, or he can be part of the bad guys, and depending on which side of the fence he falls, he can be the reason why the story ends up really bad. In that sense, he is as important as the artist to decide who wins. And there is at least one novel, Needful Things, where he is also the artist, where we have Alan Packborn, county sheriff, and amateur magician. But more often than not, he can also be the violent man, which is a completely negative figure in King's novels, and when that happens, well, we have Rose Mather as a good example of it. Things get bad when the figure of authority is in the bad guy's side. While most of the figures of authority in King's books are cops, because what better way to portray authority than a person with a uniform and a gun, some can also be teachers. And while cops can be either good or bad, when the authority is a teacher, they are always good, which is not surprising since King was a teacher himself, so he obviously has some love left for the profession. There are more men than women in this role, but the few women that we have are incredibly memorable, like in the Tommyknockers, and in fact, the very first one we meet is in Carrie, in the form of teacher Rita Desjardins, who is the one who really understands how terrible the treatment Carrie receives is, and the only one who tries to stop it before it gets really bad. The most interesting thing about the figure of authority in King's work is that unlike the cops, teachers, and general adults in horror, they may start ignoring the obvious evil growing in their communities, but once they are made aware of it, they won't hide their head in the sand. And if they are in the side of good, they will do everything in their power to stop it. Which is great, since a lot of time they are the ones with the knowledge needed to stop the evil, so they also become the mentor to the artist. Or the main hero if we have no artist. That is not a good situation to be in. Having no artist. But if it happens, well, we are a little bit better with a figure of authority than with no one. If there is no figure of authority and no artist, I don't want to imagine how bad that situation is because it has never happened. A good example of this is Father Callahan in Salem's Lot. As a priest, he is the best qualified to fight the vampires, especially vampires who are weak to fate. But at first, he doesn't believe that there are vampires in Salem's Lot. He gives a lot of theories of what may be happening in reality, all the way until he faces a vampire directly and he cannot deny the truth anymore. Unfortunately, Callahan is also the addict in Salem's Lot, which makes him a little less than effective when it comes to facing Barlow, but we discussed that when we talked about Salem's Lot. Check that video. We also have those figures of authority who will have an open mind from the beginning, such as Sheriff Walter Bannerman, who shares the role of the figure of authority with Johnny Smith, who, let's not forget, was a teacher for most if not all of the book. Sheriff Bannerman calls Smith to help with a murder case, fully aware that this may cost him the election for the post in the future, as no one believed that Smith could really see the future or the past. And yet, because he knew he needed to stop the Raincoat Killer and make sure that the women in his town were safe, He risked everything by calling and trusted Johnny. When the figure of authority is a negative character, it's because it's mixed with either the violent man, as we saw in Rose's mother, the addict, as we saw in Salem's Lot, or the outcast, who also happens in the stands, not with Nicandros, but with another lesser figure of authority that we will see when we get to the outcast. The one exception to this isn't desperation, but we will see that soon in a future video when we see how bad it is when the person who is supposed to hold the order and law of the white is the very first person corrupted by the crimson and the evil. Unlike the sacrifice that is barely known in most of King's books, the figure of authority is one of the characters we get to know the best beside the main character, who is usually the artist. This is because most of the time, the first time that we meet the figure of authority is as the antagonist of the artist. The one who doesn't get that there is danger, that will even come as far as to deny help to those who need it, or worse, by upholding the law, helping evil because evil is taking advantage of loopholes. It is only through the story that the figure of authority gets a good dose of reality, realizes that the evil is real, and turns into an ally for the hero, even if they usually can't be present on the final confrontation. In the case of Nicandros, the figure of authority we are going to follow in the stand here, he begins with literally no authority at all. He's a 22-year-old deaf-mute grifter who just goes from town to town trying to earn a living when he happens to be beaten by the town's bullies of Shoyo, Arkansas, just as the beginning of the Captain Trips pandemic. He is then jailed because the sheriff of the town, John Baker, suspects him of being a vagrant. But after reading Nick's story, as Nick may not know Sing language, but he knows how to read and write, lets him stay at his house and manage to hunt down most of the men who attacked Nick, except for Sheriff Baker's brother-in-law, Ray Booth, who happened to be the leader of the bullies. I have to say that the fact that Nick is deaf-mute is a very interesting way that King used to give us the story without having Nick actually saying or telling his story. I love that part of the book. Actually, I love Nicandros. He is one of my favorite characters in the stand, and it shows. In this way, by the way, Sheriff Baker has a short, non-supernatural version of the figure of authority arc. He begins as the antagonist of the hero, and then becomes his best ally by the end. And then he goes the way of most figures of authority. Yeah. Let's go to that. Unfortunately, the sheriff and one of the inmates start showing symptoms of the superflu, so he deputizes Nick to take care of the inmates while he gets better. Spoiler alert, he will not get better. At all. And the whole town will die of superflu, the whole town except for Nick, who happens to be immune, and Ray Booth, who is sick but still managed to gough Nick's eye and injure him before Nick finally kills him before the actual virus. And one would think that this is the end of Nick as a figure of authority, given that with the town and most of the USA gone, there is no authority to uphold. But the second he meets another survivor, Tom Cullen, Nick becomes the leader of the tiny group, since Tom is developmentally disabled with the mind of a 6 years old or so he actually needs a lot of guidance. From then on, however, as they meet with more and more survivors, Nick is still seen by the others as the leader, despite his own disability, maybe because he still has a sheriff badge, or maybe because he just exudes authority at times. In that sense, it's very interesting how with most of the government gone, so is most ableism, at least in the case of deaf-mute people. At least in the case of the good guys, because the bad guys still treat Nick and Tom horribly. And here's where the real arc of Nick as a figure of authority begins. Because the moment we start with the supernatural plot, he becomes the skeptic, not trusting Mother Abigail's vision, and even then becomes one of the leaders of the Free Zone of Survivors against Randall Flagg. He keeps his place as an authority, doing exactly what the figure of authority must do in order to help the main characters. Sacrifice himself if necessary. The figure of authority is in a very interesting situation because they are the ones who, because of their job, have made a promise to defend people. They are, so to speak, professional heroes. This is why they are most often than not cops, but on occasion we will get doctors who have made an oath to try their best to save their patients in suffering and, most importantly, cause no harm, teachers, who of course will protect their students to death, and priests, who have also promised to follow their God's commands, which usually include saving the innocents and fighting evil, even if it's in a metaphorical way. That means that when things get bad, really bad, they will always take the bullet for the artist or the child. Not always voluntarily. We can't forget the horrible death of Dr. Johnny in Salem's Lot, which could have been a lot worse had King's editors not stepped in the last moment, and, in one particular case, complaining all the way to the final moment, the dead zone, where we have the rare case of the figure of authority being the main character who had no artist to protect. But in the end, if it comes between surviving or saving those that they have sworn to protect, the figure of authority will always put others before him. I will not tell you now how Nicandro sacrifices himself, because even if I am talking spoilers, as now you know he dies before the book is over, the situation why he dies, the reason why he dies is surprising and sudden, so I want you to get that particular shock by yourself, if you read the book. Personally, I think the original miniseries didn't do justice to the scene, and I haven't watched the new series to know how they deal with it, so it's a moot point. What is interesting is that, while he was not the only figure of authority of the Free Zone, he is the first one of them to die. Yes, the black person survives him. Not for long, but she does. After him, they start dropping like flies until just two remain, both of them to face Randall Flagg together with the artist. But then, we're talking about the second biggest evil in King's world. So of course it will take more than one sacrifice to completely defeat it, just as it took a great sacrifice to let him in on the earth. Because that is the role of a figure of authority most of the time. To become the second sacrifice, the one who stops the evil after the first sacrifice led the evil in the world. And of course, in the very, very rare case that a figure of authority is evil, their death is also the point where the evil starts losing, because they lost their dragon, as it happens of course in Rose's Mother, or in the Desperation, which we will get to know soon. The figure of authority is one of the most tragic elements of the Stephen King formula, and it is very rare that they will have a happy ending. Possibly the very worst situation is when the figure of authority has no artist to back them up, because then it is sure that they will not completely be able to destroy or even win against the evil, as we can see in the Dead Zone. Johnny dies, and yes, he managed to stop the destruction of the world, but Greg Stilson is still alive, even if he won't become president. And he's probably not going to jail for his crimes, as only Johnny knew of them. And even when Alan Backward had some artistic talent, he couldn't save his beloved Castle Rock. Keep that in mind for future videos, as we will meet more and more tragic figures of authority in our world. I want to thank my dear patrons Mitch Hyman, Elaine Ho, Jessic, Ellie Riley, and Rita Philip Leo, as well as my first supporter Tanya Pineda and Amy Sung, who is the best person in the universe and without whom these videos would not exist. I also want to remind you that if you want to support these and my other projects and get your name mentioned here, you can do so at patreon.com/Adalisa, with a link on the description, as I know my name can be hard to spell, and with just $1 a month, you will always be thanked in my videos, as well as get access to a ton of art before anyone else. Or if you prefer a one-off offer, a coffee with just one donation of $3, and you will get mentioned in 3 next videos I make. If you can't support me this way, I also accept likes, subscriptions to the channel, and of course, you sharing the links. I also welcome all your questions, feedbacks and suggestions in the comments box below. And well, while my next video will probably be Desperation, remember, when we return to the stand, we will talk about the role of the violent man in Stephen King novels.